is Dr. David Griffiths, who is honorary reader with us at the Institute for Northern Studies at UHI, University of Highlands and Islands. And David works at the University of Oxford, where he is a reader in archaeology. And David is, of course, a well-known Viking specialist who has spent many, many years working in Orkney, excavating in Orkney, and has published a huge number of articles and also recently a book. And today he's going to be talking about, can you all please mute your microphones as you are joining? So David will be talking about his fantastic excavations at the Bay of Skaill, and the result of his work there, together with a number of other scholars over the last, God, it must be since 2003, is it, David? So quite a few years. So we're very much looking forward to hear what you have to say, David. So please go ahead.
And David's microphone is muted.
While we are waiting for David, can I make sure that you all mute your microphones so that you don't interfere? At the bottom of your screens, you've got a number of buttons, so please make sure that the microphone button is red. You can also switch off the camera, because that reduces the interference in the whole call, because we have so many participants. And also, if you have questions, we'll take questions when David is finished, and you can, the best thing is to write them in the chat function. And again, at the bottom of your screen, if you move your mouse around, you will see there's one button which is like a little speech bubble. If you click on that, you can type in your question, and I will then read them out, and David can answer them. So that's me for now, David.
I hope everybody can see me. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be invited to give this seminar by the UHI, which I've had a lot of involvement, both the Archaeology Institute, who've been an important partner in the research that I've been doing in Orkney, and latterly the Institute for Northern Studies, which I'm delighted to be associated with, because my own journey has been one towards interdisciplinary studies, and I think this is a great way of approaching the history of the Northern Isles. So I'm going to give you an overview of this fieldwork that I've been doing in the West Mainland. But I hope in the process, not giving you too heavy a kind of data science picture, but to try to get over to you something which I suspect most of you already have for yourself, and that is the love and enjoyment of these landscapes, which are a very special place, and one which I've grown to know very well over the years, and often think of, especially during the days of lockdown, as a kind of place I'd rather be in many ways. But let's look into why we went there to study. You'll see in the first slide, which I hope is visible to everybody, the road sign, which is just beside the new community centre at Bursae. And behind it, just in the corner there, behind the lamppost, is the former local school, which is now a sort of a tourist hostel, or would be at the moment. I imagine it's probably closed. And this is where my field team was put up during the work that we did there, and it was our home from home, as indeed was the Barony Hotel down the road, which we favoured with our evening entertainment. You'll be able to tell from my accent that I'm not Orcadian. I'm from the northwest of England and partly North Wales. And the reason I went to Orkney in the first place was that I was taking part as an undergraduate student in a train excavation, which was run by Chris Morris, who I see is here. If you want to wave to us, Chris, I can just see your, there we go. This was way back in the mid 1980s, and I was, I suppose, taken with Orkney to the extent then that I could never quite get it out of my system, and the idea of returning to Orkney and doing field work was a dream at that point, and it became a reality some years later when I took an academic job and the means and ability arose to be able to start a field project. And I'll explain a bit about how we arrived. But the outcome in some ways is the, now I have to try. Can you see me change the, seems to be a bit of a problem here, changing slides. I don't seem to be able to do that. Alex, are you able to help?
No. What? It worked before and it doesn't work now.
Is that visible to you?
I can see the first slide, but not the second one. That's what it's trying to do. That's very odd. Do you want to close it down and stop sharing and start again? I think that's
okay.
And why? Because it did work before.
Sorry.
If you use the mouse for the first, to change the first slide with the mouse on the bottom left, and then it should change after that. So on the bottom left, you should have a pop-up.
Okay.
It worked fine 10 minutes ago. So
It's sometimes with WebEx, the first slide doesn't change, and you have to use your mouse, and then it'll work.
Is that showing?
showing. Not in slideshow mode, but yes, it's showing.
Have you got the second slide now?
Yay, we do.
Okay, let's carry on with this then.
Perfect.
I can't see myself anymore, but hopefully you can see me in the corner. Once again, there is someone who's got their microphone on, and there's quite a lot of interference coming down through that, so make sure you shut that off. So the outcome of the long history of work on the area is this monograph, which we published last year with Oxbow Books, and this details really 15 years of research starting in 2003 on this area of the West Mainland. And my imagination was taken with the Bay of Skaill and with Bercy Bay way back in the 80s, when every year it seemed at that time there was new stuff emerging with coastal erosion, and there was a rescue archaeological response, which Chris and a number of other archaeologists were heavily involved with at that time. And indeed, Chris's own third monograph on the Bursae Bay it will shortly come out to complement this, and this will detail work done a bit earlier on, which was very much site-based. By the early 2000s, my perspective had moved very much on towards a landscape archaeology perspective, and this was built around the idea that you could work away from the known archaeology into the unknown, particularly using more recently developed survey techniques such as geophysical survey and really taking the bigger picture in. And in order to produce that bigger picture, we needed to have bigger research questions, moving on perhaps from the glory days of Anna Ritchie, Chris Morris, John Hunter, who worked in the area, and earlier on, of course, the famous story of Skara Brae with Gordon Child way back in the 1920s, all of which were responses to an immediate threat to the archaeology. The perspective had moved from reactive to immediate threats caused by bad weather, coastal erosion, and coastal change, to a predictive model, so that we were actually looking at the broader picture and see how we could manage these landscapes for the benefit of conservation and heritage into the future. Did that slide change work okay, Alex? Can you see the third slide?
Yeah, perfect, David.
Yeah, okay. I think we're moving now. Historic Scotland. or now known as Historic Environment Scotland, really took me under their wing back in the early 2000s, because they were then, and indeed continue to be, seriously concerned about the rate of loss of coastal archaeology in all around Scotland, but in the Northern Isles, especially on the Atlantic front. And there's, as Caroline Wickham-Jones' seminar, the last one in this series, illustrated, there are a tremendous number of sites around Orkney and other parts of Scotland which have been exposed by the sea. And I wanted to try to find out more about their context in the landscape, what they were part of as part of the bigger picture. And Historic Scotland listened, I think, with an open mind to this bid for funding. We're also very, very happy and pleased that Orkney Island Council supported the project. So it's very important. It's a great thing for me today to be able to, in a way, give it back. We were funded over the years by these public authorities, and the responsibility lies now to give the information back and to make it better known. So all these different organisations helped to fund the project or otherwise participated, and the UHI was a part of it as well, through its physics unit, as it then was, now part of Orca, and a number of colleagues. Single out Ingrid Mainland as a particularly strong contributor to the project, because she did all of the animal bones, which I'll get onto in a minute. So I'm going to start with the bigger picture, and that is what makes up these landscapes? Why are they important? What are the once again, we've got some interference here, so could you please turn your Jill, I think, maybe, could you turn your... That's better.
Oh, okay.
Turn your microphone. This is Bursae's photo I took from Orkney back in 2010. And you can see that this, you're looking from the north, you can see the hills of Hoy way to the south. And the rising ground on the south of the bay, leading up to the hill that divides Bercy from Marwick, just a bit further south. And the middle of the bay is characterised by a wind-blown sand landscape. In the middle, you can see a large area of sandy links, and then the palace village is just in the centre left. You can see the palace there, famously, which we've all visited many times. Really behind where the camera is sitting now, of course, is the point of Buckhoy and the Brach of Bursae, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. I think the key thing that interested me in a methodological sense here was, how can we see through this blanket of wind-blown sand to try to understand the archaeology that is there? You can see in this slide, there are several very important sites. In the middle distance, just over on the south side of the links, is a large settlement mound called Saver Howe, which was excavated in the late 70s by John Hedges. Bit of a confusing site, difficult to interpret some of the excavations that have gone on here, particularly the very early ones in the 19th century. And Chris's team back in the 80s did a coastal survey, and we have the record of that in his monograph on sites in Bursae village and around the bay. But we were able to use geophysical to move further into the landscape, work out what was going on. And the key question behind this, and I'll come back to this, is where did the early settlements, where were they situated? And then somewhat later on, why did they move away? Why is this landscape now largely free of settlement? You'll see the palace village there. The core of that is historic. We've got the palace itself and the church of Magnus. Many of the other houses near the bayfront are relatively modern in Bursae. But if you look behind up on the hill, this is where some of the historic farms are now. And the same pattern is evident both in Marwick and at the Bay of Skaill, that the farms of the Middle Ages and the post-medieval period have crept away from the seafront, higher up the hills, and the seafront has been largely under-occupied since that time. And then, of course, we've got a spread of much more recent housing in that area. So what is producing this curious effect where perhaps after the Viking period, people moved away from the coast? And I think it's a lot of it's to do with climate change in the Middle Ages, changes to agriculture, and to the general subsistence economy of the area. The most famous site in the area, certainly for the historic period, will be known to most, if not all of you, and this is the Broch of Bursae, the Tidal Islet, which lies off the northwest tip of the mainland, and which is approached by a way, which I would imagine most of us have visited, in some cases many, many times. And there's the guardianship monument in the top right with the late Norse medieval church, possibly to be described as a cathedral related to the Norse earldom, and around it are the remains of the Norse longhouses, which are all scattered across the slope. Right in front, really on the edge of the cliff, is a very, very densely packed archaeological area with a tremendous number of buildings, all conjoined and built out of one another. And there's a tremendous amount of detail here, which will be evident in Chris's third monograph, is evident in his first monograph, and of course John Hunter's work. This is another example of the way in which we tried to tackle the archaeology of the area. We have a very clearly defined protected site here with its beautifully mown grass under the care of Historic Environment Scotland. But what lies outside it? What about the bigger landscape? This is also vulnerable to coastal erosion. And I think linking the known sites with the unknown is a really important step forward in terms of landscape archaeology. And we've helped that in this area of Orkney. This slide's a bit, there's a lot of images here and it's a little bit complicated. It goes to serve what I've just been saying. If you look on the lower left-hand side, this is one of Chris Morris's diagrams from his monograph of 20 years ago. And you'll see all the dots along the coast. These are interventions, they're excavations designed to rescue archaeology from collapsing sections of the cliff. And every winter, this cliff is put a little bit further back by the sea. And in the you'll see a magnetic susceptibility survey, which we did early on in the project. And the bit shaded red are essentially displaying traits of human settlement over time. We can't date them from this kind of diagram, but they provide a concentration for us to investigate further. So it's a broad-based prospection method. And you'll see the red colours are patchy at the western end of the point of Buckwoy. This is because they're quite concentrated around the number of mound features which exist there. Whereas on the eastern side of this survey area, the red is more widespread. And this is really because there is probably more settlement and it's more evenly spread in that area. The composite diagram, the 3D diagram at the bottom right is Save a Howl. It's a survey we did of that particular mound at the southern end of the links, much more recently in 2011, where we're trying really to excavate the mound by electronic signal as opposed to buckets and spades. It's a very fragile feature and is already very badly eroded. So we're trying to sort of do a 3D map of this and a number of other mound features across these three bays. The extent of the geophysical survey at Bercy Bay is displayed here. We targeted, this is using gradiometry, so this is one of the more popular and detailed forms of geophysical survey. I won't bore the pants off you by taking you through it in enormous detail. That is laid out in the monograph. You can see we did do quite an appreciable area on the Broch itself. linking together the excavations in the guardianship area and the PD Brach, which lies almost at the southern tip of the island. And around the bay, we did selected. These are quite big areas, even though they look small compared to the whole map. We did selected areas around mound features, scheduled monuments, and other types of remains, which had already been mapped by previous projects. And this gave us, I think, quite a lot of detail about the kind of archaeology that's here. Having said all that, Bercy Bay started off as quite a big focus in the project, but was really superseded by the Bay of Skaill when we came across some particularly exciting archaeology there, which I'll take you through in a couple of minutes. I don't want to miss out Marwick, which is the bay between Birsay and Skaill, a somewhat smaller but very beautiful bay. It's a very lovely area, actually, Marwick. It's one of my favourite parts of Orkney. You can see the landscape is very heavily influenced by improvement in the 19th century, these very square fields, and it is a very heavily farmed landscape today. I'm sure most people who've been to Orkney, or those of you who live there, are regular visitors to Marwick. It's a long, thin road that comes off the road between Bursae and the Bay of Skaill, and you go down to the bay. There's a little car park down there, and of course you can walk along to the boat noosts by the former fishing further to the south. We wanted to study Marwick because there was some evidence of known sites here, and it seemed another good candidate for extensive survey. What was also here was a major settlement site right on the coast, which is scheduled and which was suffering very badly from coastal erosion, and indeed has suffered even more badly since. I went down there last year and was a bit shocked, to be honest, to see how much of it had gone. And that's where the red dot is. And we did a more traditional rescue type excavation there, rather more of the style that I was describing, which a number of archaeologists had conducted earlier on in Bursae Bay. And here we have a broad picture of settlement in this small and beautiful area. The early archaeology seems to be grouped very near the coastline. There is this site with the eroding settlement remains I'll mention in a second. There's a chapel which was noted many years ago by Stora Clouston, was later surveyed by Raleigh. That's lying out in a field, somewhat covered in nettles, but not under immediate threat. And then further inland, you have some historic farmsteads, Netherskaill and Langskaill. Now, these names, the Skaill name is the same word as we have at the Bay of Skaill, and it comes from the Old Norse Skáli, or if you're Icelandic, you pronounce it Skáli. And a Skáli is which we see quite commonly across Orkney, but also other parts of the Viking world, Iceland, the Faroes, northern England, where it's frequently written out as Skaill. The most best known one of those would be Windscale in Cumbria, chiefly known today from the presence of a nuclear power station. But in terms of a place name, denoting a significant Viking Age settlement. Place name scholars are a bit divided about what Skáli actually means. Excuse me. It has been interpreted in a very diminutive way as a hut, a minor settlement, but people writing about the Northern Isles have tended to stress its power and importance. It's maybe not at the top of the hierarchy of Viking Age sites like the earldom sites might be, but it's relatively prosperous and important. It's about one rung down from an earldom site, and a Skáli would have been a principal farmstead in its area, possibly quite a large building, which would have attracted all the dues and payments from the surrounding subject farmers. What we have at at Marwick is probably an original scarly, which has been divided into two, hence the two separate names here. Why is it away from the coast on the flank of the hill? Well, that's interesting, and we'll come back to that. Here is a slide of the excavation we did in 2009. There are various features coming out of the eroded section here. Floors, the ends of walls. The thing over on the right with the red box around it is a very substantial stone-built drain. And we got two dates here for the Viking Age, which seem to indicate part of the site, at least, is in the transition between the Picts and the Vikings, sort of the 9th century. That was very rewarding, even though we only dug a small part of this site. We weren't able to dig the site in plan, because just over the edge there on top of the site is a road, which of course people will know. But further inland in the field beyond the road is the chapel, and you can see bottom left a resistivity plot of the chapel, showing the four walls of the chapel itself in the centre, picked out very strongly, and then around it is a enclosure, which is almost certainly a burial ground. And beyond that, you can see the run rig cultivation ridges coming towards the chapel, but not quite covering it. It's always been left by the cultivation pattern in this field. It's very interesting. And there, of course, is the place name on the road sign to Langscale. So here at Marwick, I think we tried to put into practice the core ethos of our project, which was to use geophysics to identify the main points of interest and to clarify exactly what they were, to use targeted excavation to try to get as much as we could out of the landscape to answer research questions, particularly about the early medieval period, and then looking broadly at the landscape to try to work out how it had developed at that point and since. Here's some more geophysics at Marwick. The gradiometer plot on the left looks a bit, like looking at a television screen that's gone a bit skew-if, but with the careful eye of a geophysical interpreter, you can see some useful features going on here. And of course, the resistivity plot on the right is a bit clearer. I think we'd give those who aren't quite as used to looking at geophysical data a good impression of the chapel and its surrounds. The only bit you can actually see in the field, which is upstanding, are the walls of the chapel itself, and even they are pretty low and quite badly degraded. So I'd like to move on to the Bay of Skaill now, which is well known to many people, most people in fact, through the presence of Skara, which is the site clearly in the foreground here. Probably the most famous archaeological site in Scotland. A fabulously complex warren, stone corridors and walls, which I think most, if not all of us listening today will have visited. And I was very pleased to take a group from the Institute for Northern Studies round that area last year, almost exactly a year ago, actually, I think it was. We had a great day out. And Skara came to light. Well, we now think it was known about before this, because there are hints of a number of accounts of a major prehistoric site being known in this location. But its rise to prominence began in 1850, when part of it was exposed by storm, and the laird from Skaill House, William Watt, decided to start digging into this mound and exposing warren chambers and corridors. There's sound interference here. Could you please turn off your microphone? I think possibly Martin Brockett might be the source of that interference. Skara. So exposed in 1850. At that time, it was under a great deal of sand. It was a great sandy mound, hence the word bray, meaning mound or hillock. And in the ensuing century, nearly all of that sand is gone. It's adjacency to the sea has changed. It's now really surrounded by the sea on three sides and is very vulnerable to ongoing erosion. It, of course, does have a concrete wall surrounding it, which was built in the 1920s, but I think people are quite worried about its long-term future. And other sites around the Bay of Skaill have disappeared. The mill, which is just across from Skara Brae, was upstanding within living memory, and that's all gone. So it is an enlarging bay, and the ground behind it is being slowly eaten by the sea. People think, because this is a World Heritage Site and Skara Brae is so famous, that the Bay of Skaill will have been studied by vast numbers of archaeologists for many years. And the answer to that is they would be wrong, because a large part of the bay, particularly the northern side, when we arrived there in 2003, had only been studied in a very minor way by field archaeologists. There were some hints of evidence cropping up from across the area, notably a prehistoric burial that was found in the late 1980s, further up from the coast into the sandy areas away from the sea. And that's a very well-published site. But what of its context? How can we see the landscape itself as a whole? So this was part of the underpinning for the project. The first archaeological dig to take place at the Bay of Skaill was as long ago as 1772. And this was done by a group consisting of George Lowe, who was an Orcadian antiquarian, and also Sir Joseph Banks, a very famous figure of late 18th century intellectual life, who was very closely associated with the voyages of Captain Cook. And he called in at Stromness on the way back from a tour of the North Atlantic and Iceland, and a group of educated gentlemen, and I think they were all gentlemen, went out to the Bay of Skaill. Why they picked that is not explained, but a number of mounds in the sandy landscape were opened up, and we have this wonderfully antique record of these investigations in the journal Archaeology, and here's one showing a rather tidied up view of the inside of a prehistoric tumulus. The building on the left is probably Skaill House, which is the lairdly residence, but it's the only building we know of that was of that size and would date back to that sort of time. The earliest part of Skaill House dates back to 1628. And in them they found quite a bit of what appears to be mainly Bronze Age funerary archaeology, very similar to the Kiss grave that was dug in the late 1980s, a little bit further up the bay by Magnar Daland. Here's probably an amber bead here depicted, and a human femur. There's also this wonderful map drawn by Frederick Walden, who was part of this party. The bay is at the top here, and the body of water at the bottom is the Loch of Skaill. You can see just by the stream connecting the loch to the bay, the site of Skaill House. And then the rest of the bay is covered in these small pockmark-like tumuli, sand hills. And we've had some fun constructing Walden's vision of the bay. If you look at the photograph, if you can see that, I went up to the top of the hill and took a photo. And seen from that perspective, the bay does seem rather squashed, and indeed has that kind of shape with the on the southern side, which seen directly from above is barely visible as a feature, but from this particular angle comes out more strongly. And it's almost certainly where Walden was sitting when he drew his map. That area of the bay is known as the Hope, which is known as a word in Orkney for a sheltered embankment or harbour. Some of these features had apparent structures on them. There on the left is a close-up of the excavation itself, of the tumuli in the centre of the bay. In the middle is a mound with what appears to be a building on it. I'll come back to that. And on the right is the parish kirk of St. Peter, looking rather different to how it looks today. That's because the church was rebuilt in the 1830s after subsidence, and the previous version did have a form of steeple on it. So that's what's showing here. I'll just go back to the main map. Strangely enough, that's right at the top on the right-hand side, which I think, again, the perspective here is a bit skewed. The mound in the middle is a mound which appears to be now known as the Castle of Snooskar. And here we have a later Ordnance Survey map from 1902 showing us where that is, the north side of the bay. And there are a whole series of large sandy mounds here, which we found very interesting when we first went there to reconnoitre the site for fieldwork. There's no building on it now, although there are hints that there was one up to about 200 years ago. Exactly what this drawing is showing is difficult to be certain, but archaeology shows that this mound is very substantially archaeological and is really a layer cake of wind-blown sand archaeology. So here are the mounds that we've mapped around the bay. The other key archaeological discovery here, which people will know of, is the Skaill hoard, a large hoard of Viking silver found in 1858. And this was found by a lad who was out kelping with an iron hook, and it was found in a rabbit burrow. The material was collected by George Pottery, who was an antiquarian resident in Kirkwall, and then it ended up in the National Museum in Edinburgh, fortunately for us, because it's been preserved. And you know, this is a very major Viking hoard. It's the largest Viking hoard from Orkney, dates to about 950 to 970 AD. And James Graham Campbell has reappraised this hoard in the monograph, which we've published recently. Where was this hoard deposited? Was it deposited as a secret cache way out in the middle of nowhere in the countryside? Or did it in fact form part of a structured sequence of occupation? Was it there because people were about to establish a residence in that area? Well, it would appear probably it was. We didn't find any more of the hoard when we were digging in the area, and we weren't expecting to. I'm sure it was all taken out of the ground in 1858. There was an awful lot of sifting. A lot of people were down there once news had travelled of this hoard, and you know, various local stories accompany where it went to after that. But Petrie, I think, got most of it. So we went treasure hunting, really. What we were hunting for was the treasure of knowledge. Where was this hoard deposited in relation to? What do these large sandy mounds indicate in terms of the settlement and landscape history? Other sites in the bay which are scheduled or known about. Just to the west of Skaill is another big mound which is also suffering quite bad erosion, and there was a Viking grave found there in 1888, and James has written that up as well. I'll show that in a minute. And on the north side of the bay is a Brach Site, Veron. You can get to that along the little path that goes from the car park next to the kirk. Not a huge amount visible today, but it's quite a significant site. You know, how did that engage? How did that form part of the sequence of what was going on in the bay in the Iron Age and the Viking Age? This is where the burial is on the south side. You can see Skaill there. I think this is probably taken a few years ago, this actual photo, and I've added the annotation onto it. We did do geophysics around this area, but of course it was resurveyed at a much greater extent by Orkney College as part of the World Heritage Site programme a bit later on. So we now have a lot of data from this area. Here are some of the finds from the 1888 discovery: a beautiful comb and comb case, spearhead and a whetstone. James has dated this burial to around about the mid-10th century, which is quite late for the Viking Age. We're accustomed to thinking that the Vikings really arrived in Orkney in all their warrior-like terror and their long trips. About the late 8th century, probably around about 800. This is the traditional story. Yet most of the archaeology dates to considerably later. Certainly the archaeology bears a very strong Scandinavian stamp. What is going on in these centuries? This is something which has really had me thinking for the past couple of years. And I think there's an intermediate phase from about 800 to 950 where, yes, there may have been some Scandinavian influence, but it wasn't quite yet as dominant as it appeared in later centuries. And I think this is a very, very interesting time. I'll come back to it. Here are a couple more mound sites that we surveyed. We did do some work on the Brach site. There was a rescue excavation there some years ago on an Iron Age midden. I personally think that this particular site might have some potential for the very early Viking Age in the area, because the other Viking sites that we've surveyed do date to sort of 10th century onwards. And we know from Shetland, from sites like Old Scatness, that the first place that we see Viking or Viking influence is within the existing Pictish sites. We have an example of that in Bercy Bay at Buckhoy, where a site dug by Anna Ritchie has really just started to move towards the Viking period. And it's a very interesting picture there. This other site, Linnehow, is further north, sort of northwest of the kirk, a large stony mound. We don't know enough about it yet. It's quite badly damaged in places, but we did do a survey of it. Is that also an early defended site? Possibly. This is the extent of the geophysical survey around the Bay of Skaill that we and Orkney College together have been able to produce over the past sort of 10 years or thereabouts. Everything south of the Central Road is Orkney College data, and thank you to them for allowing us to publish a joined up diagram of this in our book, and we will be reciprocating by contributing our data from the northern side to their book on the World Heritage Site. The area which we did most of our intensive work is at the northern end of this, and you can see in the blow up there a series of very dense clusters of black and white dotty kind of stuff, and these are the settlement mounds that I've already referred to. The long stripy things which people will be intrigued by are geological features known as igneous dikes or igneous swarms, and they underlie the archaeology. Although curiously, they do seem to underlie some of the more prominent archaeological sites, including one going right through the middle of Skara Brae, underneath it, of course. But, you know, I don't think we can be sure as to whether the early settlers in Skara Brae were aware that they were on top of a major igneous geological feature or not. But they do form a pattern in the landscape that's quite intriguing. The archaeology is usually displayed more subtly than the geology, and some of the softer grey marks are indeed archaeological. I haven't got time to take you through it all in detail, but it is in the book. Looking now at the northern side of the bay, this is Snooskar, the castle of Snooskar, the mound that I mentioned earlier, which was first known to have this name in the old statistical account of 1795. So the name dates back in written sources to the late 18th century, but clearly could itself be a lot earlier. And of course, it does have a Norse inflection to it. Snoo or snoos does appear to indicate prominence. It's often used as the name of a nose or a headland, and gar would be from Gorth or Garth, meaning an enclosure or farmstead. So prominent farmstead, possibly, but nothing terribly visible on the surface today. And indeed, it was on the flanks of this mound that the Skaill hoard appears to have been found. We don't know precisely where it came from because the records aren't robust enough to tell us. But it seems to come from this particular field, and there at the T-junction nearer the bay is the mound of Snooskar. Just to the left or to the east of that, you'll see a sandy mound with an open trench, and that's our excavation in 2010, which I'll come to in a minute. Once again, this is a photo that we took on a beautiful day. It adorns the front cover of the monograph, shows all its fabulous glory. Skara Brae is at the south side of the bay, so the furthest away from the camera, as you can see it here, and then in the distance you can see the hills of Hoy away down there. So a most wonderful location to practice archaeology and to survey. And as I've shown you in the previous slide, the technique of geophysics has allowed us to unlock some of the secrets of this landscape. Where the little road goes through south of the kirk here, you'll see a mound there, which is the road is rather cut through the eastern flank of that. And that did produce quite a bit of archaeology in the 1930s, including some human remains, which were reinterred down by the shore. And there's a little cross down there. And that probably is itself now vulnerable to erosion. The old road prior to that used to go around that mound, which is that looping road that you can see, much beloved of people parking their camper vans these days. And we have this kirk standing out on its own, really away from any major local farms. This area is slightly deserted when it comes to historical settlement. We're looking past the historic age into the Viking Age and beyond to find settlement remains. And the houses that are in the middle of the bay, Seaview, the little bungalow there, and others, they're all relatively recent, built in the mid 20th century or thereabouts. So this was a sort of a deserted landscape, much like those deserted landscapes we see further south in Britain, where you find a church standing on its own in the middle of a green field. What was going on here in the Viking Age? Why do we have these mounds? Why was the Hoard here? How can we unlock some of these secrets? So here are the mounds, and the sites that I've been describing. Important to note, of course, that south is at the top of the screen here, if anyone's a bit confused about what they're looking at. Just behind Skaill is Skaill House. Come back to that. We did a lot of mapping. This is a study of Snooskar itself, the topographic model, and you'll see it's quite flat on top. It doesn't seem to be entirely natural the way it's been shaped, and that is another hint of its archaeological importance. And close-up geophysical survey, which showed a great deal of detail, and it turned out in excavation that this was actually quite difficult terrain to excavate, because it's all, what geophysics shows you is a two-dimensional picture, and in fact the archaeology is three-dimensional and quite complex, and overlain on top with a great deal of more recent disturbance, including kelp burning, which was quite a well-known pursuit in the area. And of course, the story of the discovery of the Hoard includes the notion that people were gathering kelp here. In the northwestern sector here, you know, now north is at the top of this slide, you can see some walls, and we're pretty well convinced, even though we haven't really excavated the entirety of this site by any means, that this is a major longhouse. A lot of Viking Age material came up from the stratified middens here, including bone pins, spindle whorls, etc. And it was a rewarding first look, albeit at a very disturbed site, on this particular mound. We use lots of different types of geophysical technique to try to build that three-dimensional picture. Electromagnetic survey, ground-penetrating radar, and a lot of the material, a lot of the data was processed on site to give us a hint of, you know, where if we were going to excavate, how deep we should go and how to interpret it. Here's some GPR, ground penetrating radar survey of Snooskar, and you can see the layers inside the mound are quite flat. It's built as a sort of flat series of deposits of stone and sand. The archaeology is near the top of the mound, and yet the mounded shape is a result of erosion and wind over the centuries. It's not a classic burial mound or a tomb like Maze Howe, which was probably shaped like that to start with deliberately. It really is sort of an artifact of human agency and environmental processes working together in this very soft, sandy location. A large trench in the Snooskar Mound. You'll see our site up there, now sadly decommissioned and living out its retirement in a byre in Orfa, but it had to be strapped down, of course, because even in the summer months, some of the wind was quite spectacular in the bay. And this trench is cutting down through those layers we've been able to map using geophysics. Moving on to the mound further to the east that I mentioned just then, that's the East Mound. This is not a historic name like Snooskar. It's in fact a name we gave it. It has no real name. We called it the East Mound because it was east of the other mound. And then, of course, we found another mound further to the east of that. And we had to think of a name for that. So with very lackluster imagination, we call that the Far East Mound. So in the end, we just decided to give all these mounds numbers, which is how they've been described in the book. But the East Mound remains, I think, our most rewarding excavation. You can see it's partially eroded from this angle. This is looking at it with your back to the sea across the Tussocky Meadow. Really, it wasn't even that well known as a feature. That the local farmers they were vaguely aware that there was a mound there, and they'd even, dumped a few old bits of track from time to time, but it hadn't really acquired a reputation as a potential archaeological site in the same way that the Snooskar mound had. Clearly, the Hoard was found at Snooskar, and that had raised its sort of reputation a bit. And we thought, well, to begin with, it could just be a sand dune. It's just a rolling hillock of sand. And indeed, very early attempts, the first trench we put in there was pretty unproductive and very, very nearly gave up, actually. But one day we did begin to find archaeology coming through, and this was incredibly exciting. And it went on through a series of seasons to become really a very rewarding site. Firstly, we had to get through a large amount of sand. This is a very sandy landscape. And I think the sand is part of the key as to why these settlements were abandoned in the Middle Ages. The sand was blowing in, and this is an effect known throughout the North Atlantic region, actually, that as sea level changed with the Little Ice Age, wind-blown sand became more and more of a problem in the coastal areas. And there are, in the Western Isles, in the Faroes, other examples of settlement areas which migrated away from the coast at this time because of these environmental difficulties. And the Orkney rentals of the 15th century show null values for a number of the farms in Sandwich. And if you read William Thompson's fabulously informative books, you can winkle out from those to find, actually, yes, environmental change was happening at the time. People were responding to that by moving away and abandoning settlements, which had been a going concern in somewhat earlier times, notably the Viking Age. So here we're digging back through layers of environmental catastrophe of the Middle Ages to get back to the Viking Age. And slowly, from under the sand emerged firstly the middle part, and then later the full extent of a large Viking Age longhouse with attendant buildings, metalworking hearths. Here in the lower part of the slide, you can see an entrance. You're walking into the building and turning right to walk down the byre, moving towards the right-hand side of the slide. Left of the measuring stick is the domestic or household area, and this is beginning to be exposed in 2008. It took us till 2010 to really get the measure of this building. Here we have our team excavating, clearing the last of the wind-blown sand from the interior. And then underneath that were a whole series of laminated floors packed full of environmental archaeological evidence. We thought by extending the trench by 12 meters to the west that we would capture the full extent of the building. We had no idea how big it was going to be. We had to dig a further trench beyond the end of it in order to get the full measurement. We're very lucky, in fact, that that came smack down on the end, as you can see in the little inset photo there. Just opening up this site, after so many centuries of wind-blown sand, was an amazing process. And I think some of you here today may have been there, or at least visiting when we were doing it. is a site tour in process, with the site largely exposed by this time, and we're teasing apart the phasing and the amount of material inside it. The bit nearest to the camera is the byre end, where the animals were kept, and a sort of workshop, and the further away bit is the central hall, the cooking hearths, and the sort of side benches where people would have slept. Nearer to where the people are standing are the sort of ancillary buildings, the metalworking workshop, and these are approached through a yard and then up a stone staircase, which was still intact. You know, this is really wonderful archaeology. We got quite a bit of coverage in the local press at the time. There's one of our combs which was found, and thank you to the Orcadian in particular, a wonderful local newspaper, and the excellent Sigurd, who was a frequent visitor to the excavations and covered them in a very, very erudite and knowledgeable way, which I think really was very helpful to get the message over to the local community. We tried very hard all the way through the excavation to keep the community on side and to have open days and to have lots of local volunteers working with us. And thank you also to the Orkney Archaeological Society for their support of the project and helping to fund our flight in our aeroplane, which took those amazing photos. So it's an aerial view of the site sort of prepared at the end of the 2010 season for photography, and you can see a wonderfully clear picture of a large Viking domestic structure with its attendant byre and ancillary buildings, its metalworking hearths. And what was this structure? How did it relate to the other one, much less well preserved on Snooskar, a broader landscape? And I think we've kind of taken the view throughout this that this in fact is a Skaill. This is a Skaill type building. It may not have been the only one at the Bay of Skaill, and I'm not necessarily saying the bay was named after this particular building, but it exemplars the kind of structure of Viking Age settlement here. We took our team to sit on the side benches, and when you put the people in there, you can see the size of the building is quite impressive, and you can imagine 30 or so local individuals, some of whom would have been quite senior, sitting around the fire of an evening way back in round about 1000 AD, 1025, and having really a conflab about what was going on in the area, perhaps talking to people who'd come in from other parts of the Viking world. Some reconstructions here, turf on the outside, and then this rather splendid stone masonry facing inwards into the interior space. And you can see the central hall there with the domestic area nearer to the camera, and then the byre at the furthest end. And this would be a relatively typical style of construction for a Viking Age longhouse in the Northern Isles. Some of the nicer features we found these really interesting scratch marks on some of the stones in the walls, and they appear to be tally marks. The one in the top left is the clearest, where you have a tally of 10, 9 down strikes and 1 across. The others are a bit overwritten, and we're not quite sure about that. I did show these to a famous runologist, and he said I think they were runes, which was a bit of a disappointment. There are some slight runic hints to some of them. Some of the finds, which was a nice haul of finds, a high bone and horse ring pin, a number of combs, one of which was particularly well preserved, iron rivets, a little banded whetstone, which is the sort of thing that you would find in a North Atlantic or Norwegian style settlement. There's some good ones from northern Norway. This is the metalworking hearth, and we have quite a bit of ironwork from the site and a lot of whetstones, and clearly there was sort of a good deal of artisan processing, belting and construction going on here. Some of the rivets appear to be boat rivets, which is good. You would expect that in a Viking Age site so close to the sea. A lot of good environmental evidence from this, and some nice glass finds, Some lovely beads. The one that's there in somebody's hand is a very early one from the 7th century from Northern Europe. And of course, that one on the right, the orange bead, is made out of amber. On the left, sorry, you can see a glass linen smoother. It's been a bit damaged, part of it's missing, but the rest of it's very well preserved. Another classic Viking find, very often found in graves for the most part, not so often found in a domestic settlement context. And some more combs and some very interesting pottery. Now, the pottery seems to hint at a lot of trading contacts with the Irish Sea area and even with northern France. And the combs have an Irish feel to them as well. Steve Ashby, the comb expert who's written them up, feels very strongly that they're relatively early Viking Age combs, but they have a lot in common with Dublin examples. And going back to the ring pin, a classic Dublin style pin. So are we talking here about a true Scandinavian colonial site? There is quite a bit of steatite or soapstone from the site, but some of which is probably Norwegian, but most of it comes from Capland and the other quarries in Shetland. This very strong Irish flavour. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because in the early to mid Viking Age, you know, the 10th century, perhaps the early 11th, this is clearly a site which is participating in a trade route extending down to the Irish Sea into southern Britain. The actual links with Scandinavia are a little bit muted at this point. They seem to come in a bit later, in fact. A later site such as Coigru on Westray, James Barrett's site, has a stronger material culture signature linking it to Norway, and that's in the 12th, 13th century. So in fact, at this point, the Viking world's a much more mixed up and less monocultural world than we all thought, or certainly than we were taught in former days. I won't go into too much detail about the archaeological science we did, but there was a lot of geochemical mapping. This just shows you some of the phasing of the building. The original hall house was quite simple, and that was later built onto as the settlement extended itself over about 50 years. And the radiocarbon gives it quite a tight, interesting chronology. Originally 3 or 4 separate buildings, they all become joined up essentially over time into one substantial farmstead. The building here, as compared to other Viking Norse longhouses, you can see one on the top left, and some of the others from Orkney and Shetland, together with Mossfell in Iceland and Adalstrati. Not all of these are complete discoveries. The little urban building at Dublin actually compares quite nicely to the ancillary building in the early phase of our site, which is the one at the lower part of the slide here. But overall, in terms of a developed longhouse that had reached its full extent, the nearest comparison, in fact, is actually Jarlshof in Shetland in terms of size and morphology. You can see our longhouse here on the left and house 1 from Jarlshof on the right there. Many years ago by the Ministry of Works in the 50s. A very good excavation which we've reinterpreted very helpfully in relation to our structure. You can see in the foreground of our slide, first of all, the very sandy nature of the land here, but also the byre end with its central stone corridor, the division with a stub wall and a little doorway into the main hall area, and then beyond that, at the far end of the building, is the domestic area with the cooking hearth and the ancillary building over to the left. This has all now been covered up with geotextile, covered in, all the sand has gone back, and the mound is back how it was before we started, grazed by sheep. It's a very fragile site. People often ask, well, can you not just, you know, expose it like Skara Brae and have people wander around? Well, it's a possibility, but if you think of the amount of work that went into stabilizing and constructing Skara Brae visitor site. That's no mean challenge. And for us, it was having done the archaeological work in terms of the preservation of the site, we felt it was best to return it to the protective blanket of the sand. But it's down there and it's relatively well protected. And who knows, I hope to see it again one day. Broadening out to the broader landscape of Orkney, we're familiar with these sandy mounds. Saver Howe in Bercy Bay at the bottom there, a multi-period mound, certainly with interesting Pictish and Viking phases, now badly eroding because of the wind and sea. But lots of other mounds. These are the farm mounds, famously visible on the island of Sandy, but quite a few other places in Orkney as well. This has got obviously a much later steading on top of it, but you can see the mound. And I think these scaly sites, these head farms in their district, are very important, and they do leave a legacy of settlement which can be picked up in much later centuries. And really there are an enormous number of sites in Orkney which deserve to be looked at in the same way that we've attempted to expose and elucidate the archaeology at the Bay of Skaill. And what they tell us is a story of settlement over time, settlement moving away in the cases of the areas we've looked at from the frontage, the high energy front of the bay where you get the towering waves and the blowing wind, away up the slopes to the slightly more secluded landscape. In the Bay of Skaill, it would be the area around Coiloo, where a number of the historic farms, Stove and other important farmsteads are located. And that movement probably occurred in the 15th, 16th centuries or thereabouts, leaving the fronts of the bays quiet and denuded of settlement and really open to the attentions of archaeologists. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, David, for a fabulous overview, not just of the excavations here of Bay of Skaill, but the whole project across all the different bays. That's incredibly interesting, and to see the parallels between the excavations at Bay of Skaill, and to see that in relation to Yarlsop, I think was particularly interesting. So if you have questions for David, feel free to use the chat function, and you can write these messages there, and I can read them out. The thing is best if you try not to unmute microphones, so that we get a more quiet, so that everybody can hear what we're saying. Go on, David.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get you back as a full screen here.
If you stop sharing, if you don't want to show the PowerPoint anymore, so if you go down to the button at the bottom of the screen, you've got the buttons that you used before, and there's the share screen function.
Yeah, that seems to have disappeared on my. We got through the PowerPoint anyway. I'll just leave it as it is, I think, because I don't want to interrupt the flow any further.
That's great.
See me, by the way?
No, I can't. I can only see the PowerPoint at the moment.
Okay. I'd quite like.
So we have some. It's okay, David. That's fine. We can just leave it. We have some questions that have come up. So first of all, if we could have the details of your book again, that would be good. I think that'd be relevant.
Okay. It's I would like to get myself visible here somehow.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm not an expert on Cisco.
If you get rid of the PowerPoint, that might be a start.
Yeah, I'm trying to do that. You've gone into a very small panel at the bottom of the.
If you get rid of the PowerPoint on your own screen so that you stop having it.
I have got rid of that now. It seems.
Okay. If you move your mouse button, are the buttons there? The mute microphone.
No, unfortunately not. No.
You have another second screen maybe that's popped up. If you go down to the bottom and you see the WebEx Teams.
Stop sharing. There we go.
Yay! Aha! And now you switch your camera on, then we can see you.
Ah. See me now?
Yes, you're coming now.
Okay. Well, hopefully I can see everybody else. This is the book.
Yay, there we go. Beside the Ocean.
Beside the Ocean. You might ask why that title was chosen. Well, it's a tribute to John Mackay Brown's Beside the Ocean of Time. And that's all explained in the preface. But it also encompasses a nod to Barry Cunliffe's Facing the Ocean. It's a story of long-term settlement in the Atlantic margins, and which I think is also a very important kind of inspiration. The book is available from Oxbow Books, which seem to publish most of the archaeological monographs from Britain and Ireland, and it's £45. So if you just go to the Oxbow Books website, you should be able to order it. You know, it's sold reasonably well, I think, for an archaeological monograph. There is all the data in there, but there's the story as well. There's the reappraisal of the earlier sites by James Graham Campbell and of the Hoard. And also there's a wonderful little section on folklore by Tom Muir. Excuse me, we have a wonderful folk tale from the Bay of Skaill, or about the Bay of Skaill, which is a genuine Orkney folk tale called The Finn King. And I don't know if anybody knows this, but it's in his book, The Mermaid Bride, and he's rewritten it in a way and interpreted it as part of this particular archaeological study. There was a sea monster which was causing problems at the Bay of Skaill by eating all the fish and mucking up all the fish. And a local boy called Johnny Brass, which is the name of the family actually who own the site that we worked on. I don't know if there's a direct connection there, but in the tale he slays the hideous monster on the beach. And the monster's body is set to a pyre, and the smouldering remains of this heap are now known in the folk tale, described as being the Castle of Snooscarth. So that's almost the origin of that mound, explained in the folk tale as the cremation pyre of the sea monster. But the detail that interested me was that he becomes a local hero, this guy Johnny, and he's allowed, as a result of his newly increased status in the local society, excuse me, to get married to a local girl, Jeannie Irvin. And so they have their wedding. It's a very windy day. Fiddler there. And the fiddler plays music and everybody dances. And so says the folk tale. They danced so hard in the gale of wind that a whole raft of sand blew up from the bay and covered all the houses. I think there's a hint in the folk tale there. Actually happened, has been witnessed archaeologically, that these houses were covered in sand. It's very interesting. Go ahead if anyone's got any questions.
Yeah, thanks, David. So we have a question here. Could you tell us a bit more about the causeware pottery and its connections with Ulster and Man, please?
Yeah, well, this was studied by Derek Hall, who did the pottery report. And they took a petrology sample from the pottery, which tells you where the geology of the clay came from. And it's that and certain granite inclusions in that which have been linked to the geology of Ulster in particular. But there's also a Manx variant of this type of pottery called granite tempered ware. Certainly does seem on the petrology to be an Irish Sea type of, there's only really one pot actually. It's a lot of pieces of the same pot of that type. In fact, compared to the steatite, there isn't a vast amount of pottery from the site as a whole. The two main types are the white wares, which are the Norman French wares, which are kind of at the very end of the site's active existence, and then this coarse ware, which appears to have been imported from the Northern Irish Sea area. But you know, I suppose you'd have to, there's a limit to what you can say about one pot.
Right. Yeah, thanks. And another question is, what will be the impetus to redig the site in the future?
Interesting. Well, I think we stopped digging when we felt we'd got a really good picture in terms of evidence of the full extent of the settlement. We didn't excavate the entirety of the longhouse. There's a bit missing at the western end between the end of the main trench and the little trench we dug to find the full extent of it. So there's one section of the interior still there unexcavated, and this I think is something that archaeologists like to do when excavating a site if they don't have to excavate the whole thing, because it isn't necessarily under immediate threat, was to leave a bit for future archaeologists. We've left a small section. In fact, I think probably quite a critical section, really. I suspect there may be a corn dryer in there because there's a lot of burnt grain just outside that, you know, within the trench next to the bit we didn't dig. Yes, people could devote, I could devote yet more resources to going back there, to exposing yet more completeness of the building. There's probably more to the cluster of buildings, actually, and there may be buildings to the north of the main longhouse that we didn't explore. And it's a question of whether that, you know, that's the right thing to do, or in fact to follow up some of the other hints in the geophysics of sites elsewhere in the bay. I think there are more archaeological sites dotted around the bay that have never been tapped into in terms of excavation, and that would be an alternative way forward. You either concentrate all your resources on getting 100% out of one site, or you split them up a bit and get 15, 20, 30% out of a range of sites. And I think, you know, the future, that question mark is there for the future, and it will be up to the owners of the field, the Brass family, to decide what happens to the site, whether they wish to keep it wrapped in its sandy, you know, blanket, or whether at some point in future they might wish to expose it. We have had, you know, some discussions, but at the moment they're happy to continue using the field for the purpose they want it for, which is farming, and we're happy with the haul of evidence we got out of it when we excavated it.
Yeah, thanks, David. There certainly seems to be a, you know, a lot of archaeology to sort of investigate, even just around that area. But I had a question, if I may. Just, I think it'd be interesting if we could hear a little bit about the chronology and maybe how you put this building in relation to the Norse settlement in Orkney in general. You know, there's been a lot of debate on when the settlement started to happen, the Norse settlement started to happen in Orkney, and just maybe to get some views on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, with the help of Historic Environment Scotland, who have a contract with SUERC, the Scottish University's Environmental Research Centre in East Kilbride, we got a significant number of radiocarbon dates done on these buried remains. We had 60 in all, which is quite a lot really for, well, the East Mound and Snooskar together, mostly East Mound. So it is one of the better dated excavated Norse settlements in the North Atlantic Viking world. Typically in earlier days, people might have 4 or 5 radiocarbon dates for an excavation. To go to 60 for one, you know, main trench and its attendant buildings, then that's quite a lot. We have a chapter in the monograph written mainly by Derek Hamilton, who's a wizard of Bayesian statistics based at SUERC and University of Glasgow, a very well-known guy in the fields of archaeological chronology and radiocarbon. Very lucky to get him on board on the project, actually. And he I won't try and explain Bayesian stats at this point. It's quite complicated, but it's all to do with isolating and drawing down probabilities to different events in the history of the site. And it seems that the chronology of the East Mound settlement is quite tight. The building was really built right at the end of the 10th century in its early phase, and then was mainly in use in the early to middle 11th century. So 990 to about 1060. And then there's a sort of long tail of use when it slowly becomes used for less and less prominent purposes, ends up as a sort of animal fold before the sand fills it up and it disappears from view. There's a hint in the radiocarbon from the Snooskar Mound that the very fragmentary remains of the Longhouse there are probably a bit earlier and may date to a couple of decades earlier. Interestingly, taking us right to the point when the Skaill Hoard was deposited. These buildings seem to date from at that point and then just afterwards. What was there before? Well, we didn't find really anything much to indicate that these sites had been built on top of an earlier site. Underneath the Viking Age walls, there seems to mainly be a great depth of windblown sand. So these particular sites do not seem to be founded on top of a Pictish site, which is what we're told to expect in some ways. They seem to have been founded de novo or from new in an open landscape around about 950, 970 onwards. And this is what I'm saying, this going back to what I said earlier in the presentation. These are developed, important settlements, and they seem to take shape at this point and then go on to dominate the next decades or couple of centuries. And this is really beginning to become the middle part of the Viking Age as we've always understood it. What was happening in the early Viking Age may be very different. This may be where we get hints of Scandinavian settlement in existing sites, and Old Scatness is the sort of clearest example of that in Shetland, but probably Buckfoy and Orkney as well. And then there's some kind of transition around the middle 10th century that may possibly be something to do with the conversion to Christianity. And we get these graves like the one at the south of the Bay of Skaill, very curiously dating to around about this mid 10th century period as well. I don't think we fully understand what was going on at that time, but it does seem that the beginnings of Viking power and the full control of the landscape in Orkney made it a bit later than we've perhaps been accustomed to thinking. And that very, very early Viking Age, the 8th, early 9th century, remains, I think, to be tackled as a research problem. Even the Orkney Inga saga is not, I mean, it tends to get quite semi-fictionalized the further back you go. Not everyone would agree with that, but really it's the great, as Barbara Crawford called it, the great age of the Earls, of Thorfinn, Sigurd II, who died at Clontarf in Ireland, holding the Raven Banner, of course. Why were the Orkney Earls so interested in Ireland? Does this explain the Irish Sea influence we have in this site? Interesting stuff. It's not possible in the early period to point to absolutely consistent links to Scandinavia in the material culture. It's much more of a mixed up picture. Okay.
Yes. Oh, thank you. That's perfect. That really puts us into a much bigger context, and we can see, exactly how much more there is to do and how many questions we still have unanswered. So I think you leave us wanting more, David.
Well, I'm pleased to have done my duty as the visiting reader and given a presentation to Orkney College or UHI audience this year, which wouldn't otherwise be possible because, of course, I can't travel up there, and sadly, be the first year for a couple of decades that I haven't been to Orkney, and it's just the unusual circumstances we find ourselves in this year. But I have felt like I've been there this afternoon. Yes,
that's fantastic, and I can tell you that we've had absolutely record-breaking numbers. 130 people joined. Yeah. So hence that why it was slightly chaotic at the beginning. I think the system just couldn't cope, and the mute function didn't work, because I think people just kept joining in. So so that's why. But you know, we are so pleased that so many people did want to join and managed to connect as well.
Well, thank you all for coming, and it's a bit hard for me to, from where I'm sitting, to know who's here. No doubt I probably know quite a few people, and hello to those who I do, and to those who I don't, then welcome, and enjoyed it, and I'm glad that you share with me a kind of love for this amazing set of landscapes, which I hope to visit again before long. And if I could just say one last thing, we did a nice foreword for the volume, where I managed to persuade a very well-known novelist called Andrew Gregg, who's written extensively about Scottish landscapes, and in particular is an enormous fan of the Bay of Skaill. I discovered that Andrew had a thing for the Bay of Skaill some way into the project. I'd read some of his books and thoroughly enjoyed them, and very pleased that Andrew wrote the preface, or wrote the foreword for this this book. And would it be all right if I just read a little bit of that out, Alex?
Yeah, go on, David.
As a sort of end note, this is Andrew Gregg's words rather than my own. You may have come across him. He wrote Electric Bray and The Loch of the Green Corrie, and another famous works of recent Scottish literature. He's also a poet and a musician, but I'll just read out his last paragraph. The study reported upon here is like none other I know of. It pulls together many excavations, a multiplicity of sites, markers and human stories, landscape, deep time and folk history. It is the science of archaeology raised to a humanist level. In attending to detail within a wider vision, it arouses wonder at what we know and what we don't, what we have been and what we are, and our all-encompassing context of history lived among the sea and the land and the sky. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's fantastic. So fitting end, I think. And I've been told here on the chat there are some people who have questions, but they can't actually find the chat function themselves. So maybe, you know, I can pass on questions later to you, David, and if you can help us answer them, if there are people who have any questions.
Yeah, happy to do that. And I'd just like, before I go, I should definitely mention my senior members of my team, my co-authors Jane Harrison and Mike Athenson, and just want to make sure that this wasn't just one person's effort. It was a group effort, and we received a lot of help from local people in Orkney and various local contractors and businesses, and this was all part of the story as well. Okay.
Yes, thank you. And just for everybody as well, so that you know that this is being recorded, and it will be available on our website to watch for anybody who wants to see it again, or anybody who has missed it today.
Jolly good.
Yeah, so I think we'll say thank you to David once again. And then I can also tell you that we have another seminar on the 1st of July, when we have another of our honorary readers. We have Dr. Natasha Miller from the University of Vienna, who will be talking about the Northern Isles in the 16th century. So we'll be hearing moving from the Viking Age and hearing about the Hanseatic period and the trade in the North Atlantic then.
Thank you for being such a gracious chair, Alex. And you know, if the slight problems at the start were caused by lots of people joining, then that's a good thing, isn't it?
Well, that's right. That's what I think. So thank you, everybody, and we'll hope to see you another time.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.